Hello, I'm Steve Shields, author of Signature Books 2021 publication, Divergent Paths of the Restoration, 5th edition. I'd like to talk a little bit more about the period of fragmentation that began with Joseph Smith's death and wrapped up about 20 years later. As I mentioned in a different video, there were approximately 50 different contenders for succession in the leadership of the church. Just because one person had more numbers than another doesn't necessarily mean he, and in every case, these were men for the most part, doesn't mean they were the right one. In fact, the number of people who initially followed James Strang rivaled that of those who initially followed Brigham Young. There was a lot of rivalry between the two men and the two organizations. Generally, each of the leaders who emerged after Joseph Smith's death was loyal to his understanding of what Joseph Smith was all about and what the work Joseph Smith had begun was all about. As time marched on, there were only 6 denominations that emerged from the fragmentation period and have continued to the present. There was only one organization, and that was the small church in Richmond, Missouri of David Whitmer, that lived well into the mid-20th century, albeit with only a handful of members. The 6 who have continued into the 21st century were those originally led by James Strang, Brigham Young, Alpheus Cutler, Joseph Smith III, Granville Hedrick, and William Bickerton. Bickerton is the only one of the 6 who was not a member of the original Church 1.0. He came to the movement and came to a belief in the work of Joseph Smith through Smith-Rigdon's first church organization that was based in the Pittsburgh area, Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania area. James Strang, although Smith-Rigdon was the first to set up a rival church organization, James Strang was a virtually unknown, newly baptized church member from Wisconsin, but he did present a formidable challenge to every other contender for church leadership and for succession in the prophetic office. Strang had been baptized in early 1844 at Nauvoo by Joseph Smith himself, was sent to find a settling place in Wisconsin for church people. At Joseph Smith's death in June of 1844, Strang produced a letter which is known as the Letter of Appointment, which bore the date June 18th, 1844, and the name Joseph Smith at the bottom. Strang's faithful believe the letter to be authentic. Historians are undecided on the matter because of handwriting and other possible arguments to the authenticity of the letter. However, at Forey, Wisconsin, near Burlington, Strang went on to claim that at the very moment of Smith's death on June 27, 1844, an angel appeared and ordained him as prophet. Strang produced his own translations of ancient metal plates that he said were given to him by an angel. He issued numerous revelatory documents and effected an elaborate church organization that saw him crowned king in 1850, following Joseph Smith's efforts to be king of the kingdom of God. Wasn't that unusual? After Strang was killed in 1856 by 2 disaffected followers, the church disintegrated, but has maintained a small contingent that is still faithful to his teachings. Strang did not provide for a successor at his death, so the church has continued without benefit of the leadership of a prophet, maintaining that a prophet would have to be provided for by angelic intervention. In the Latter-day Saint traditions, priesthood offices and organizations can be passed on by others of the priesthood, and the leadership of a prophet would not necessarily be required to have a full church organization in practice. Brigham Young, of course, emerged as the most numerically successful of the leaders that emerged after Joseph's death. He was president of the Council of 12 Apostles, a leader in his own right, had lots of missionary experience, was a good organizer, was articulate. He believed by 1847 that there should be a reorganization of the presidency so that the 12 could execute the missionary work of the church. So Young determined to reorganize the first presidency with himself as president. Wilford Woodruff wrote in his journal, said, "I had a question put to me by President Young, what my opinion was concerning one of the 12 apostles being appointed as the president of the church with his two counselors. I answered that a quorum like the 12 who had been appointed by revelation and continued by revelation from time to time, I thought it would require a revelation to change the order of that quorum. Whatever the Lord inspires you to do, to Brigham Young, in that matter, I am with you." And so on December 5th, 1847, the 12 under Brigham Young deliberated on the issue for several days. Orson Hyde made the motion that Brigham Young be president of the church and that he be allowed to nominate his two counselors. Wilford Woodruff seconded the motion, and the motion carried unanimously by the 12 who were present, and not all 12 of them were present. On the 27th of the same month, at a conference in winter quarters, there were only about 1,000 people, they approved the action. So it wasn't a representative conference of the entire church membership. It was just those who had followed Brigham Young approved of that action. Within 1 week of the arrival of the first company of pioneers in Utah on August 6, 1847, Brigham Young required everybody to be rebaptized and reconfirmed as members of the church. Rather unusual move, and historians could only determine what the purpose of that might be. A similar thing was done again in 1856 in Utah, and priesthood members at that time were reordained to their priesthood offices as well. For a long time, Brigham Young and his followers in Utah hoped that one day Joseph Smith's sons would come to Utah, and if they did so, they would be given the right to take their father's place at the head of the church. In an 1856 sermon, Heber C. Kimball said, "At present, the prophet Joseph's boys lay apparently in a state of slumber. Everything seems to be perfectly calm with them. But by and by, God will wake them up, and they will roar like the thunders of Mount Sinai." Well, in 1860, I guess, according to the reorganization, that happened. Brigham Young continued to reassure his followers that Joseph Smith III and his brothers would receive special blessings of leadership. But after the reorganization, now Community of Christ, had formalized its organization, Brigham Young maintained that, well, if one of Joseph's children takes the lead of the church, he will be welcome and find himself at the head of our church, and I will receive him willingly. Interesting perspectives. Alpheus Cutler was baptized in the original church in 1833 and moved with the church through its various hardships, finally settling in Nauvoo. In 1839, Cutler was called to serve as a member of the Nauvoo High Council, served honorably, in that capacity throughout the Nauvoo period. When the church left Nauvoo, Cutler was appointed captain of one of the companies of pioneers and began to head west, but elected to stay in Iowa rather than proceed further west with Brigham Young. Cutler claimed he had been ordained as one of 7 special men who were given power by seniority of their ordination to reorganize the church if it became rejected. Cutler maintained that he was the 7th member in seniority of this special council and that the church became rejected when the saints were forced from Nauvoo before the temple had been completed. And so on September 19th, 1853 at Manti, Iowa, Cutler effected a reorganization of the church by requiring the members of his settlement to be rebaptized. Cutler viewed this as necessary because he maintained that a reorganization was not a continuation of the rejected church. Only Cutler himself was not rebaptized, as he felt it would sever the ties of authority between him and Joseph Smith. When the RLDS Church, or Community of Christ, became more firmly established in 1860, many of Cutler's followers, including family members, went into that organization. Cutler died in 1864, but the church continued, moving first to Minnesota and then in the early 20th century to Independence, Missouri. The church continues a practice of what most LDS call the endowment, or the upper room work, which was introduced in Nauvoo by Joseph Smith and publicly conducted by Brigham Young. Details of the ceremony are unknown. Its meeting houses in Minnesota and Independence are considered to be temples with the upper floor reserved for the special upper room work. The movement that culminated in the ordination of Joseph Smith's eldest son, Joseph Smith III, as president in 1860, began in the early 1850s under the leadership of Jason W. Briggs, Enos H. Gurley Sr., and others. These men had been members of the original church. They had led branches of the church after the prophet's death. In their search for a prophetic successor of Joseph, these men and those associated with them found they could not follow Brigham Young because of the doctrinal claims he promoted. In his search for the true church, Jason Briggs, driven to seek the will of God, November of 1851, reported a revelation in which he believed that he had been told that a lineal descendant of Joseph Smith Jr. should be the successor in the prophetic office. All of this after Briggs and Gurley and others had been a part of Strang's organization. Briggs began sharing that November 1851 experience, and shortly afterwards a conference was called, and originally they called the church name the New Organization of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. Members of this group met sent representatives in the fall of 1856 to Nauvoo to persuade Joseph Smith III to take his father's role in the work, but he declined and spent many years studying law and serving as Justice of the Peace in Nauvoo, an elected office to which he was elected successively on several occasions. But on April 6, 1860, the young Joseph, now only 27, was accepted and ordained prophet and president of the church at a conference in Amboy, Illinois. Joseph Smith III stated that he was doing so in response to a power not his own. Community of Christ has maintained that the successor to a prophet must be designated before the current prophet's demise or resignation. This, they maintain, is in accordance with the word revealed to Joseph Smith Jr. as published in the Doctrine and Covenants. And that tradition has followed through, even though many members of the Smith family served in those offices. Most recently, Grant McMurray declined to name a successor and in a letter of instruction to the 12 apostles, ordered them to meet and pray and determine a successor and decide amongst themselves. By the time the reorganization got rolling in 1860, Brigham Young had been in Utah for almost 15 years, well ensconced there. Almost all of the British converts who had come to the US, first to Nauvoo, many of them, and then finally to Utah, really saw no other option. Not unusual then that we would find a lot of influence coming from England at the time. Brigham Young and Joseph Smith III were each loyal to Joseph Smith as they understood him. But there were many irreconcilable points of view too. Brigham Young saw Joseph first and foremost as the divine restorer and dedicated his life until he died in 1877 as an apostle of Jesus Christ and of Joseph Smith. Joseph Smith III, on the other hand, could see nothing redeeming about polygamy, secret endowments, overt and covert theocracies, quasi-scriptural attacks on fundamental Christian theologies of God and humanity. But Joseph III forced himself to suspend judgment, tried to understand, and eventually dispensed with an idealized view of his father, but sought to honor his memory and the prophetic calling. William Bickerton was the means, Sidney Rigdon's short-lived church was the means William Bickerton came to be what we then would have called a Latter-day Saint. He joined Rigdon's church in 1845 and was ordained to the priesthood. After Rigdon's church disintegrated, Bickerton affiliated with the LDS Church at West Elizabeth, Pennsylvania, but upon hearing of polygamy and other doctrines in 1852, Bickerton felt he had been deceived and left that affiliation. Bickerton and others who had been part of Rigdon's movement remained active as a minister and elder in the church, preaching according to his understanding. His personal testimony recounts baptisms he performed and visions he received, in which it was made known to him that his work was acceptable to God. Bickerton and others organized branches and conducted conferences. Very loose affiliation at first. At a July 1861 conference, several men were called to be apostles. Just as Joseph Smith had received revelation without benefit of formal ordination or church structure, so too the first apostles in this movement were called and ordained. Several different persons have been recorded as having received revelations that were accepted as genuine by the church. A single person prophet is not a tradition in William Bickerton's Church of Jesus Christ. Bickerton was appointed president by the apostles in October of 1861, and the church was formally organized at a full conference beginning July 5th, 1862 at Green Oak, Pennsylvania. Bickerton's first church newspaper was called the Ensign of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The revelations of Joseph Smith are not accepted as scripture. They're looked at. The Book of Mormon and the Bible are the preeminent scriptures. Anyone in the church can receive a revelation, and if it's accepted by the church, the council will be listened to. At first, there was a presidency separate from the 12, and then ultimately they've accepted and appointed or adopted a presidency from among the 12. So there's no separate first presidency, but amongst the 12 apostles, there's a president of the 12, but then there's also a president of the church with 2 counselors, all only 12 apostles, not 15, as would be the case in both Community of Christ and the LDS Church. Granville Hedrick was in Illinois, elder in a branch there. They were united by geography, several branches together. John E. Page visited the group at a conference in 1863. Page had been an apostle under Joseph Smith. He ordained 4 others as apostles, forming a nucleus for a new council of 12. The members also took action to reorganize the first presidency. Granville Hedrick, one of the newly ordained apostles, was selected and ordained to the office of president to preside over the high priesthood and to be a prophet, seer, and revelator and translator to the Church of Christ. The ordination was done by John Page and others of the priesthood of the church. Pretty much the same method as employed by Brigham Young. Hedrick succeeded to the church presidency through apostolic succession. In 1864, Hedrick proclaimed a revelation that called the small band of believers to return to Independence, Missouri, and redeem the temple lot. They moved by 1867 and established themselves there, and 2 years later purchased part of the property known as the temple lot. About 2.5 acres now belongs to the Church of Christ. Originally, the purchase in 1831 had been about 60 acres, 63 acres, I think. Over the years, the Church of Christ at the temple lot has dispensed with the office of high priest and president of the church, opting for a presiding elder, then investing leadership in a quorum of 12 apostles. The Doctrine and Covenants was not accepted, but the Book of Commandments was preferred, although not officially part of the canon. It's referred to and used. And they reverted the church name to that of 1830, the Church of Christ. The church sees itself as not a faction, but a remnant of 1830, bearing the same name, teaching the same doctrine, believing the same truths, practicing the same virtues, holding the revelations as originally given, and enjoying the same spirit. Each of the 6 separate church organizations came about because of the need of the faithful members of the original church to have leadership after Joseph Smith's death. 3, the movements of Strang, Cutler, and Community of Christ claim appointment by Smith for succession. Strang received a letter of appointment, claimed angelic ordination. Alphaeus Cutler claimed to have been designated as a member of a special council of 7 high priests. And the Community of Christ, RLDS Church, accepts the leadership of Joseph Smith III as having been designated in a blessing by his father. Brigham Young's claim to the presidency seems to have developed between 1844 and 1847. Granville Hedrick's church bases its claim to authority on a similar principle, in this case affirming that the church branches that composed the foundations of the church had been duly appointed, ordained, and organized along with their priesthood leaders. Hedrick's ordination as an apostle by John E. Page was valid, and ultimately the reorganization of the presidency of the church was based on apostolic succession. William Bickerton's church organization in 1862, after praying about the fragmented situation of the movement, was called in a heavenly vision, not unlike the experience of Joseph Smith in the early 1820s. Each of these various churches represents different stages of the original church established by Joseph Smith, yet no single organization is representative of the church that existed publicly at the precise time of Joseph Smith's death. Over the years, each church, each denomination has responded to its understanding of what God was calling it to be. This has meant changes in policy and sometimes further development of theology. Change has been necessary, as the churches each have attempted to respond to the needs of its members and the changing society and culture to which the church has attempted to minister. My book will explain more. I hope you'll get a copy. Thanks very much.